My father leaned close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath and said, "If it wasn't for pity, no one here would have invited you." The music kept playing behind us. Laughter drifted across the ballroom. Crystal glasses clinked somewhere near the bar. No one else seemed to notice the quiet little execution happening beside the wine table. I took a slow sip of red wine and let the silence sit between us. 21 years had passed since the last time we stood this close. He still thought I was the girl he had thrown out. What he didn't know, what almost no one in that room knew, was that in less than 5 minutes the bride was going to raise a glass and call me Admiral. The ballroom smelled faintly of roses and polished wood, the kind of carefully curated elegance people pay planners thousands of dollars to create. Soft lights hung from the ceiling like captured stars. White linen covered every table. A quartet played near the windows, their music floating gently above the hum of conversation. It was the kind of place my father had always admired, the kind of place he believed proved something about a family. I stood near the edge of the room with a glass of wine I hadn't really planned to drink. I wore a simple navy dress, nothing dramatic, nothing that invited questions. My hair was pinned back neatly. If someone looked quickly, I might have appeared like any other guest who had slipped in quietly to celebrate a wedding. That had been my intention. I hadn't come to make a scene. I hadn't come to prove anything. I had only come because the young man getting married tonight had written me a letter that was impossible to ignore. And because after 21 years, I was finally ready to see the house I once called home, even if it was only through the eyes of the family that remained. The room buzzed with warmth and conversation. My nephew, though we had never truly met before this week, stood near the dance floor greeting guests with the slightly overwhelmed smile of someone who had planned a wedding for months, and suddenly realized it was actually happening. He looked like his father. My brother. The thought settled somewhere deep in my chest, heavy and quiet. I took another sip of wine and let my eyes move slowly across the room. That's when I saw him. My father stood near the bar with 2 men in dark suits, the posture of someone who had spent his entire life measuring his worth by the company he kept. His shoulders were still broad, though age had rounded them slightly. His hair, once a deep brown, had faded to a careful gray. He laughed at something one of the men said. Then his eyes shifted and landed on me. The moment stretched. Recognition came slowly like dawn breaking behind a cloud. First confusion, then disbelief, then something sharper. The conversation around him faltered. He said something quick to the men beside him, then started walking toward me. His steps were steady, deliberate. I didn't move. 21 years ago, I had left his house with a duffel bag and a stubborn sense of pride. Tonight I stood in a ballroom full of strangers with a glass of wine in my hand, and the strange calm that comes from having lived long enough to survive your worst memories. He stopped 2 feet away. Up close, the lines around his eyes looked deeper, harder. "Rebecca," he said. He didn't say it warmly. He said it like someone reading a name on an old file. I nodded once, Dad. The word felt unfamiliar in my mouth. For a moment he simply studied me, his eyes scanning my face as if searching for the girl he remembered, the stubborn 19-year-old who had once stood in his living room and told him she was joining the Navy. That girl had disappeared a long time ago. Finally he leaned slightly closer. "Interesting choice," he said. "For what I asked. Showing up here." I tilted my head. "Your grandson invited me." He gave a short laugh. "That boy has always been too soft." The music shifted behind us. Somewhere nearby, someone burst into laughter. But the space between us felt cold. "You look surprised," I said. "I'm not surprised," he replied, "just curious." "About what?" "About why you'd come back after all these years." His eyes flicked briefly to my dress, my posture, the glass in my hand. "Unless you thought this would somehow impress people." "I didn't come to impress anyone." He smiled thinly. Then he leaned in close enough that his voice didn't need to rise. "If it wasn't for pity," he said quietly, "no one here would have invited you." The words hung between us like smoke. I took another slow sip of wine. It tasted dry and smooth and completely ordinary. For a moment I studied the man in front of me, the man who had once stood in a doorway and told me never to come back. Age had changed him. but not as much as time had changed me. "I suppose that's possible," I said calmly. His eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected anger, or embarrassment, or perhaps the kind of quiet shame he believed had followed me for 2 decades. Instead, I simply set my glass down on the table beside us. "You always were stubborn," he muttered. "Some habits stick." He looked past me briefly, scanning the room. "Just remember," he said, his voice tightening, "this evening isn't about you." "I know." "Good." At that moment, the band finished their song. A light tap against a microphone echoed through the room. Guests began turning toward the head table. The bride stepped forward, smiling brightly as she lifted the microphone. "I'd like everyone's attention for just a moment," she said. The room slowly quieted. My father glanced toward the stage. I did the same. The bride looked out over the crowd, her eyes scanning the room with a thoughtful expression. Then her gaze landed on me, and something in her smile changed. She lifted her glass. "Before we continue," she said clearly, "there's someone here tonight I want to recognize." My father sighed quietly beside me. But the bride's eyes never left mine. And in that moment I realized something. He thought he understood why I was here. But he didn't. Not even close. The first time my father told me to leave, he didn't raise his voice. That was what made it harder to forget. People like to imagine life-changing moments as loud things, slammed doors, broken dishes, someone shouting a sentence so cruel it echoes for years. But some of the deepest wounds arrive quietly. They come in a measured tone, a controlled face, a decision made by someone who believes their calm makes them right. I was 19 the night my father decided that my future had no place in his house. Back then, our home sat on the edge of a small coastal town in Virginia, where everyone seemed to know each other's business before breakfast, and good manners often mattered more than honesty. The house itself was modest but carefully kept. My mother polished the banister every Saturday. My father trimmed the hedges with the precision of a man who believed neatness could protect a family from judgment. Inside, everything had a place, including me. At least as long as I understood what that place was. I was the older daughter who should have been easier. That was how my mother once described me to a friend on the phone, not realizing I could hear her from the hallway. "Rebecca's intelligent," she had said in that bright apologetic voice women use when they want to soften a criticism. "She's just difficult, so independent, hard to guide." Guide. That was the family word for control. My younger brother Thomas had always moved through the house more easily than I did. He knew when to joke, when to nod, when to let our father feel like the smartest man in the room. He was warm where I was reserved, easy where I was deliberate. My mother called him charming, my father called him sensible. I was neither. I was the kind of child who asked too many questions at dinner and noticed too quickly when answers didn't make sense. I read late into the night under a lamp my father said was ruining my eyes. I stood straighter than my mother liked. I argued when something felt unfair, not dramatically, just firmly enough that my father took it as a challenge. By the time I turned 19, I had learned the basic rules of living under his roof. Don't embarrass him in public. Don't contradict him in front of guests. Don't want a life he didn't choose for you. The trouble was, I had already wanted one for years. I had wanted the Navy since I was 12. Not because of patriotism at first, though, that came later. Not because I had some romantic idea about uniforms and ceremony. I wanted it because the first time I saw a woman in dress white standing on a pier near Norfolk, she looked like the only adult I had ever seen who occupied her own life completely. She wasn't apologizing for taking up space. She wasn't asking permission to be respected. She simply stood there, shoulders squared against the wind, and the world seemed to arrange itself around the fact of her. I never forgot that. I kept the dream mostly to myself. I studied hard. I ran in the mornings before school. I learned how to make myself stronger without making it obvious. By senior year, I had already spoken with a recruiter, taken the tests, and started quietly building a future my father would never approve of. He thought I was applying to colleges nearby. My mother hoped I'd become a teacher. My father, if he was being honest, probably expected I would marry someone respectable and move into a life tidy enough for him to explain to his friends. Instead, on a Thursday evening in early May, I stood in the living room holding an acceptance packet and told him I had committed to officer training with the Navy. The room was warm from the late sun. My mother was in the kitchen finishing supper. My brother was upstairs with music playing too loudly behind his closed door. There was nothing dramatic about the setting. The television murmured from the den. My father sat in his armchair with reading glasses low on his nose and a newspaper folded across one knee. He looked up when I said I need to tell you something. He knew immediately that he wasn't going to like it. There's a certain stillness some men get when control begins slipping from their hands. I had seen it in him before. "What is it?" he asked. I handed him the packet. He took it slowly, glanced at the seal, and frowned. "What is this?" "I've accepted an appointment path with the Navy," I said. "I leave in July." For a moment he simply stared at the paper. Then he took off his glasses. "No," he said. "Just that. Not tell me more." "Not what do you mean?" "Just no." "I've already signed," I replied. He stood then, newspaper sliding to the floor unnoticed. "You did what?" My mother appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel. "What's going on?" I kept my eyes on my father. I joined the Navy. My mother looked from me to the packet in his hand and went pale in a way that made her look suddenly much older. My father's voice stayed low. "You will call them and undo this." "I'm not going to do that." He took one step toward me. "The military is not a place for you." "It is if I decide it is." "That isn't how this works." "It already has." His jaw tightened. "You think wearing a uniform is going to make people respect you?" I remember the way the evening light hit the window glass, then turning it gold. I remember how clearly I could hear the ticking clock above the mantel. Memory is strange that way. It saves details you never asked it to keep. "I'm not doing this for people," I said. "I'm doing it because it's my life." My father let out a short, humorless laugh. "Your life," he repeated, as if choices exist in a vacuum, as if what you do doesn't reflect on this family. "There it is," I said quietly. "What does that mean?" "It means this isn't about me being safe or happy. It's about how this looks." My mother stepped forward. "Rebecca, please, don't speak to him that way." I turned to her. "Then tell me I'm wrong." She didn't. That hurt more than I expected. My father folded the packet once neatly like he was containing something offensive. "You will not do this," he said. "You will not throw your life away to make some point." "I'm not throwing it away." "You are if you walk out that door chasing this fantasy." I looked at him, then really looked and understood with sudden clarity that nothing I said would matter. He had already decided what my future should be, and any version of me that strayed from it felt like an insult. "Then I guess I'm leaving," I said. His face changed. Not with rage. With resolve. "If you walk out that door for the Navy," he said, "don't bother coming back." The room went still. My mother made a soft sound in the back of her throat like she wanted to interrupt but didn't know how. I waited. Some part of me still believed he would take it back. He didn't. So I nodded, once went upstairs and packed a duffel bag with the kind of numb efficiency people mistake for strength. Jeans, running shoes, 2 sweaters. My old photo of Thomas and me at the county fair when we were children and still belonged to each other without conditions. I left before dinner. No one came after me. 3 weeks later, after staying with a friend and then a cousin while paperwork moved through and dates became real, I came back once in the afternoon to collect the rest of my things. The front door was locked. 2 cardboard boxes sat on the porch. My books were in one. My winter coat and a pair of boots were in the other. Nothing fragile, nothing sentimental, nothing that required care. Just the parts of me they could return without inconvenience. I stood there for a long time staring at those boxes while the neighborhood carried on around me. A dog barked down the street. A mower hummed somewhere nearby. The hydrangeas my mother loved had already started blooming beside the front steps. And behind the curtains I saw movement. Someone was home. No one opened the door. That was the night I learned something important about pride. Some people carry it with dignity. Others use it as a wall and call that strength. I picked up the boxes, loaded them into the back seat of my car, and drove away without knocking. 21 years later, standing in my nephew's wedding reception with my father only a few feet from me, I could still remember exactly how those cardboard handles had cut into my palms. Some memories don't fade. They just wait quietly until life brings you back to the same door. The first morning of officer training began before the sun had even considered rising. A whistle cut through the dark like a blade, followed by the sound of boots hitting concrete, and a voice that carried the kind of authority no one questions at 4:30 in the morning. "Up, move, let's go!" I had been awake already. When you grow up in a house where approval feels conditional, you learn early how to prepare for disappointment. You learn to arrive before the moment demands it, to stand ready before anyone has the chance to say you're not. By the time the barracks lights snapped on, I was already tying my boots. Outside, the air was cold and sharp with the smell of the sea. Norfolk carried its own rhythm metal clanging somewhere across the harbor, distant horns, from ships preparing to move, gulls circling above like impatient spectators. There were 40 of us in that training class. 36 men. 4 women. None of us spoke much that first morning. We didn't know each other yet, and exhaustion has a way of reducing people to the most basic version of themselves. You focus on breathing, on staying upright, on proving you belong. The instructors wasted no time making it clear that belonging wasn't something they handed out lightly. The first week was a blur of drills, lectures, physical tests, and corrections delivered with surgical precision. It wasn't cruelty, it was calibration. They were measuring how we responded to pressure, how quickly we adapted, how stubbornly we held on when fatigue started whispering that quitting might be easier. I remember the first time one of the instructors stopped in front of me during a formation run. He looked me up and down, once his expression unreadable. "You sure about this path, Morgan?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "You understand this isn't a place where you get credit for trying?" "Yes, sir." "You'll either carry your weight or someone else will carry you out." "I understand, sir." He held my gaze a second longer, then nodded once and moved on. It wasn't encouragement. But it wasn't dismissal either. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of training began shaping us into something new. Muscles hardened, movements sharpened. The uncertainty that clung to those first mornings slowly gave way to a quiet, shared understanding. If you made it through the day, you had earned the right to face the next one. I learned quickly that respect in the Navy didn't arrive with a handshake. It arrived with consistency. You showed up on time. You finished what you started. You didn't complain louder than the work demanded. And when someone beside you faltered, you helped them steady themselves before the instructors noticed. Those first months were harder than anything I had known before. Not because the training was impossible, but because the voice in the back of my mind sounded too much like my father. "You don't belong here. You're embarrassing yourself. You'll quit eventually." Every time I finished a run with my lungs burning, every time I stood at attention during inspection with sweat running down my back, I imagined that voice watching from the sidelines, waiting for proof that he had been right all along. That image became fuel. Not anger. Something steadier. Resolve. Years passed faster after that. The Navy has a way of compressing time. Deployments blur seasons together. Ports change. Faces come and go. What remains constant is the work, the endless rhythm of maintenance, strategy, navigation, and leadership that keeps a ship alive in the middle of the ocean. My first command assignment came 8 years in. A destroyer stationed in the Pacific. Standing on the bridge that first morning, watching the horizon stretch out in every direction, I understood something that had taken most of my 20s to articulate. Freedom isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the moment you realize no one is deciding your worth for you anymore. Leadership came slowly. Not through rank alone, but through the accumulation of decisions people remember when they look back. The night you stayed awake on watch because a younger officer was struggling. The time you admitted a mistake before someone else discovered it. The calm tone you kept when equipment failed during rough water and everyone else was waiting to see if you would panic. Respect grows in those moments. You don't notice it happening at first. But one day you walk into a room and people stand a little straighter. They listen differently. They trust that the person giving orders understands the cost of them. The mission that changed everything came 17 years into my career. We were escorting a humanitarian convoy through a narrow stretch of ocean that had been experiencing increasing piracy. It wasn't supposed to be dramatic. Most operations like that rarely are. Until the radar picked up something moving too fast. 3 vessels. Small, fast-armed. They came out of the fog like shadows with engines. The bridge fell silent for half a second before training took over. Orders moved quickly, angles adjusted, defensive protocols activated. The kind of choreography that only works when everyone understands their role without needing to be reminded. One of the cargo ships in our convoy hesitated. That hesitation nearly cost them everything. I remember the moment clearly. The weight of command pressing down like gravity. Do you pull back to protect your own vessel? Or move forward and risk everything to shield the slower ship behind you? There are decisions that shape careers. And there are decisions that shape who you become. I ordered our destroyer forward. The maneuver put us directly between the approaching boats and the cargo vessel. For several minutes the situation balanced on a razor's edge. Then the attackers turned away. Later during the official review, someone asked why I had moved the ship into that position. I answered honestly. Because that's where we were needed. No speech. No explanation. Just the truth. 2 years later, the promotion came. Admiral. The word still felt strange the first time I heard it spoken in a formal room. Titles carry weight, but they don't change the person who earned them. They simply make visible the years that led there. I stood on the deck during the ceremony, the wind tugging lightly at the edges of my uniform, and thought about the cardboard boxes on my father's porch. About the locked door. About the girl who had driven away without looking back because pride was the only thing she had left to carry. I wondered briefly if he had ever heard about my career. Small towns have long memories. But I had never called. And he had never tried to find me. Success doesn't erase closed doors. It simply shows you how firmly they were shut. For 21 years, I built a life on the open water surrounded by people who measured worth by action rather than expectation. I learned to trust crews with my life. I learned how to make decisions that affected hundreds of families at once. I learned that dignity grows strongest in places where no one is trying to take it from you. And somewhere along the way, without realizing it, I stopped wondering what my father would think if he ever saw me again. Until the letter arrived. A simple envelope with my name written in careful handwriting. Inside was a note from a young man I had never met. My nephew. Inviting me to his wedding. Standing in that ballroom tonight, watching the bride lift the microphone across the room, I realized something unexpected. All those years at sea had prepared me for storms. But they had not prepared me for walking back into the quiet center of the one I had left behind. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. It was waiting on the corner of my desk when I returned from a briefing, one of those routine strategy meetings where maps fill the walls, and decisions are discussed with the quiet precision of people who understand that every sentence might eventually translate into real lives and real consequences. Most of the mail that crossed my desk these days was predictable. Reports, formal invitations, letters from organizations that like to attach my name to their events for the sake of prestige. This envelope didn't look like any of those. The handwriting was careful, slightly uneven, the kind you see when someone writes slowly to make sure they get it right. Rebecca Hayes. No title. No rank. Just my name. For a moment I stared at it, trying to place the return address. Virginia. The same town where my father still lived. My chest tightened slightly before I even opened it. I had spent 2 decades learning how to make decisions quickly under pressure, but some envelopes carry a weight that slows even the most practiced hands. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. The letter was short. Dear Aunt Rebecca, you probably don't remember me. My name is Daniel Hayes Jr. I'm Thomas's son. My father passed away 3 years ago. Mom always told me you and Dad were close when you were young, even though the family didn't talk about you much after you left. I found an old photo in a box last winter. It was you and Dad at a county fair. You were both laughing like the world was the easiest place to live. I asked Grandpa about it once. He said the picture didn't matter anymore. But I think it does. I'm getting married this spring, and I would really like it if you came. I know things between you and Grandpa are complicated, but you're still family to me even if we've never met. The ceremony will be in May. No pressure. I just thought you should know you're welcome. Daniel. I read the letter twice before setting it down. The office around me remained quiet except for the distant murmur of voices in the hallway and the faint hum of the air system pushing cool air through the vents. Outside the window, the afternoon sun reflected off the harbor, turning the water into shifting fragments of silver. Thomas's son. My nephew. The words carried more weight than I expected. My brother had died 3 years earlier. No one had told me. That realization settled slowly into my chest, not sharp enough to hurt outright, but heavy enough to change the way the room felt around me. Thomas and I had once been inseparable. When we were children, we had built forts in the backyard using old blankets and broken lawn chairs. We had raced bicycles down gravel roads until our knees were scraped raw. He had always been the one who could make me laugh, even when I was certain the world had no interest in my happiness. But as we grew older, the house divided us in ways that were difficult to name. Thomas learned how to keep peace with our father. I learned how to live without it. After I left home, there had been one phone call between us, just one. He had sounded uncertain, like someone trying to speak 2 languages at the same time. I wish things were different, he had said. So do I told him. But neither of us knew how to bridge the distance my father had created. And slowly, as years filled themselves with deployments and promotions and responsibilities that demanded everything I had, to give the silence between us hardened into something permanent. Until now. I picked up the letter again. You're still family to me. The sentence felt almost foreign. Family had become an abstract idea over the years, something I watched other people build during holidays and leave rotations, something my crews carried with them in photographs tucked into lockers or taped beside bunks. For me, family had been the Navy. Ships. Crews. Men and women who trusted each other because the ocean demanded it. I had learned to live comfortably inside that world. And yet this letter, written in careful handwriting by a young man I had never met, had cracked open a door I thought had been sealed long ago. That evening I took the letter home and read it again at my kitchen table. The apartment was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic and the faint clatter of dishes from the restaurant downstairs. My life had become orderly in the way military routines often are, everything in its place. Schedules set weeks in advance, decisions made with clarity and discipline. But the question sitting in front of me didn't belong to that world. Do you go back? I poured myself a glass of water and sat there for a long time, staring at the invitation details, printed neatly at the bottom of the page. May. Virginia. The same town where a younger version of me had stood on a porch holding 2 cardboard boxes and realizing that sometimes love has conditions. The easy answer would have been no. There was no obligation. No expectation. No one could accuse me of failing my duties by declining an invitation from a nephew I had never met. But the longer I sat there, the clearer something became. I wasn't afraid of my father anymore. 21 years had a way of wearing down even the sharpest memories. The anger had faded long ago. What remained was something quieter. Curiosity. And perhaps, if I was being honest with myself, a small piece of unfinished business. Not with him. With the girl who had once driven away from that house, wondering whether she would ever belong anywhere again. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. 2 weeks later, I sent a short reply. Dear Daniel, thank you for your letter. I would be honored to attend your wedding. Rebecca. I didn't include my title. I didn't mention the Navy. Some introductions are better left to the moment they arrive. The morning of the wedding, I considered wearing my dress uniform. The garment bag hung in the closet beside my door, the white fabric pressed perfectly, the insignia polished to the exact standard the Navy demanded. But after standing there for several minutes, I closed the closet again. The uniform represented the life I had built, the person I had become. Tonight wasn't about that. Tonight was about walking into a room where I had once been told I no longer belonged, and seeing whether that statement still carried any power. So I chose the navy dress instead. Simple, unremarkable. The kind of outfit that allowed a person to move through a crowd without drawing attention. I drove to the venue alone. The sky that evening had the soft color of late spring, the kind that makes everything look briefly hopeful before the sun disappears completely. As I parked the car and walked toward the entrance, I could hear music drifting through the open doors. Laughter followed. For a moment I paused on the walkway, letting the sound wash over me. 21 years earlier I had left this town with a duffel bag and a promise to myself that I would never again allow someone else to define my worth. Now I was walking back in through the front door. Not to prove anything, just to see what had changed. Inside the ballroom glowed with warm light and quiet celebration. And somewhere across the room my father was already watching me. The bride was still speaking at the microphone when my father leaned back beside the wine table, arms folded across his chest like a man who had already decided how the evening would end. And before dinner is served, she was saying warmly, "I just want to thank everyone who helped make this day possible." Her voice carried easily across the room. The guests listened with the soft attentiveness people reserve for weddings, polite smiles, glasses held lightly in their hands, the quiet patience of a crowd waiting for the celebration to continue. But my father wasn't paying attention to her. He was watching me. "You always did have a talent for dramatic timing," he muttered. "I'm not sure what you mean," I replied. "Oh, I think you do." He nodded subtly toward the center of the ballroom. "You waited until the room was full. That's smart. Makes it harder for me to ask you to leave without someone noticing." I let the words sit for a moment before answering. "I wasn't aware I needed your permission." He gave a short laugh. "You don't," he said, "but you should understand something." He picked up a glass of whiskey from the nearby table and took a small sip. "People don't forget the way someone leaves a family." The music behind us shifted slightly as the quartet adjusted their instruments. Laughter rose from one of the far tables where a group of younger guests were leaning close together over shared stories. None of them were listening to us. That was how my father liked it. Control worked best in private. "You threw me out," I said quietly. His expression tightened for half a second. "I gave you a choice. You locked the door. You walked away." We stood there, two people separated by more than 2 decades of silence and stubborn pride. The strange thing was I didn't feel angry. Not the way I once had. Time changes the texture of old wounds. What once felt sharp eventually becomes something duller, like a scar you only notice when the weather shifts. My father studied my face as if searching for something. "You look comfortable," he said. "I am. That surprises me." "Why?" "Because people who leave like that usually end up needing something." His eyes moved briefly across my dress again, lingering on the absence of anything remarkable. "You didn't marry well," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Number?" "No children." "Number?" "Then I suppose the Navy dream didn't last long?" I tilted my head slightly. "Why would you assume that?" He shrugged. "Because most fantasies collapse when reality arrives." For a moment I almost smiled. 21 years of command decisions, midnight storms at sea, and hundreds of sailors depending on my judgment, and he still believed I had run away chasing something childish. "You've always had a strong imagination," I said. He chuckled at that. "Yes, well, someone in this family had to stay realistic." A waiter passed between us carrying a tray of champagne glasses, the faint clink of crystal punctuating the quiet tension between our words. Across the room, my nephew Daniel was leaning toward his new wife, whispering something that made her laugh softly. They looked happy, genuinely happy. And suddenly the reason I had come felt very clear again. Not for my father, for them. My father noticed where I was looking. "You think that boy invited you because he missed an aunt he never knew he asked. I assume he invited me because he's kind." My father shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "he invited you because he feels sorry for you." The words were delivered calmly, almost thoughtfully. as if he were offering helpful advice. You disappeared for 21 years, he continued. People fill in those gaps with stories. Most of them aren't flattering. I'm sure. You know what they say? I didn't answer. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. They say you ran away because you couldn't handle discipline, that the Navy realized you weren't suited for it and you drifted from job to job after that. I studied him carefully. And you believe that? He gave a small shrug. It makes sense. I picked up my wine glass again. The red liquid caught the light as I lifted it slowly. You've always preferred stories that make you comfortable, I said. Comfort has its advantages. You should try curiosity sometime. My father watched me take another sip. You're very calm tonight, he said. I usually am. Even when people insult you? Especially then. He frowned slightly as if trying to locate the source of something he couldn't quite explain. You always thought you were better than the rest of us, he said finally. Number. I set the glass down again. I just refused to be smaller. The words landed between us quietly. For the first time since he walked over, my father didn't respond immediately. His eyes searched my face again, slower this time. Tell me something honestly, he said. All right. Did you come here hoping to prove something? Number. Not even a little. Number. Then why come back at all? I glanced toward the center of the ballroom again. My nephew and his bride had finished greeting a group of relatives and were making their way toward the stage where the microphone waited. I came to see family, I said. My father followed my gaze. His expression hardened slightly. That boy is my grandson, he said. Yes. Not yours. That's not how families work. He laughed softly. That's exactly how families work. At that moment, the bride stepped fully onto the stage again and lifted the microphone. The room gradually quieted. Before dinner begins, she said brightly, There's something important I want to say. Guests turned toward her. The music faded. My father exhaled slowly beside me. Good, he murmured. Maybe we can get through the rest of the evening without unnecessary surprises. I didn't answer, because I could see the way the bride was looking across the room. Not at the crowd. At me. Her expression was warm. But there was something else there, too. Recognition. She raised her glass slightly. And before we celebrate the start of our marriage, she continued, I want to take a moment to recognize someone very special who is here tonight. My father shifted impatiently. These speeches always go on too long, he muttered. But the bride didn't look away from me. And in that moment, I realized something my father hadn't yet noticed. The story he believed he was telling tonight was about to change. The room settled into that familiar wedding hush, the kind where people lean slightly forward in their chairs, glasses poised halfway to their lips, waiting for a speech they assume will be sentimental and predictable. My father shifted beside me, clearly impatient. These speeches, he muttered, always drag on. I didn't respond. Because the bride wasn't scanning the room the way people usually do when they give a toast. She was looking directly at me. The microphone caught a soft breath as she adjusted her grip. I know weddings are usually about two people, she said with a smile, her voice warm and steady. But sometimes they're also about the people who shaped our lives long before we ever stood at the altar. A few guests nodded politely. Someone at the back chuckled softly. My father folded his arms again. I want to tell a quick story, she continued. It's a story my father used to tell me when I was younger. A story about a ship, a storm, and a decision that changed the course of his life. The room quieted a little more. I felt my father glance sideways at me, then back toward the stage. My dad served in the Navy for 20 years, she said. Most of those years were routine training missions, long months at sea, the kind of work that rarely makes headlines. She paused. But there was one night he talked about more than any other. The air in the ballroom seemed to shift slightly. Guests leaned closer. My father was stationed on a cargo escort mission in the Pacific. Their convoy had run into trouble, small armed vessels approaching faster than expected. A faint murmur passed through the crowd. My father's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. They were outnumbered, she continued, and one of the escort ships hesitated. She looked down briefly at the microphone before continuing. My father told me there was one officer who didn't hesitate. Something in my chest tightened. Someone who moved their ship directly between danger and the rest of the convoy. A guest at the nearby table whispered something to his wife. The bride's smile softened. My father used to say that moment taught him what real leadership looked like. My father shifted again beside me. This must be about some officer he admired, he muttered. But the bride wasn't finished. He said the captain who made that call didn't shout, didn't panic. She simply gave the order and trusted her crew. The word hung there. She. My father blinked. Years later, the bride said my father told me he still remembered exactly how calm she looked on the bridge that night. I felt every pair of eyes in the room turning slowly toward the stage. And he told me something else. She lifted her glass slightly. He told me that if he ever had the chance to thank her in person, he would. The room was completely silent now. Even the musicians had stopped adjusting their instruments. My father's brow furrowed. "Why is she looking at you?" he whispered. I didn't answer. Because the bride had just stepped down from the stage. She walked slowly across the ballroom floor. Her heels clicked softly against the polished wood, the sound echoing in the quiet room. Guests parted slightly as she passed between tables. Her eyes never left mine. My father turned his head, watching her approach with visible confusion. "What is this?" he murmured. When she reached us, she stopped. For a moment, she simply stood there smiling. Then she set her glass on the nearby table and raised her hand. It was a precise motion. Clean. Sharp. A military salute. The kind that comes from training, not imitation. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. My father's breath caught. The bride lowered her hand slowly. Then she turned back toward the guests and lifted the microphone again. "I'd like everyone to raise a glass," she said clearly. No one moved yet. They were still trying to understand what they had just seen. She smiled wider. "Please raise a glass to the woman my father still calls the bravest officer he ever served under." Her voice carried across the ballroom with perfect clarity. "To Admiral Rebecca Hayes." For a moment the room forgot how to breathe. My father's face went completely still. The title hung in the air like a bell that had just been struck. "Admiral!" A man near the stage blinked in disbelief. Someone whispered, "Did she say Admiral?" Another guest turned toward me slowly. Then another. The silence lasted only a second longer. Then the applause began. It started near the front table where the bride's parents were sitting. Her father had already risen to his feet, his glass raised, high pride written across every line of his face. Others followed. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Hands came together. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was clapping. Some guests smiled with surprise. Others nodded with the quiet recognition that comes when a room realizes it has just misjudged someone. My father hadn't moved. Not an inch. He stared at me as if seeing a stranger where his daughter had been standing moments earlier. "You," he said slowly. The word never finished. The bride stepped closer again. "Admiral Hayes," she said warmly, her voice now softer without the microphone. "My father asked me to thank you properly if I ever had the chance." I nodded once. "You're very kind." She shook her head gently. "No, just grateful." Behind her, the applause slowly faded. Guests returned to their seats, though many of them continued watching. Curiosity had replaced celebration. My father finally found his voice. "Admiral," he repeated. It sounded strange coming from him, like a word he had never expected to say. His eyes searched my face again, this time not with dismissal, but with something closer to disbelief. "You stayed in the Navy?" "Yes." "For 21 years. "Yes." He looked around the room, noticing the way people were still glancing toward us. "You're telling me—" "The promotion came 2 years ago." He exhaled slowly. "You never said anything." I met his gaze calmly. "You never asked." The words landed gently, but they carried more weight than anything I could have shouted. Across the room, the quartet began playing again, soft notes rising into the air as the reception slowly returned to life. But something had changed. My father could feel it. So could I. The story he had believed for 2 decades had just collapsed in the middle of a wedding toast. And for the first time since he walked across that ballroom toward me earlier that evening, he looked unsure of himself. The applause faded slowly like a wave pulling back from shore. For a few moments, the ballroom remained suspended in that strange quiet that follows an unexpected truth. Guests returned to their conversations, chairs shifted. The quartet resumed their soft music, but the energy in the room had changed. Recognition has a way of rearranging things. People who had barely noticed me earlier now offered small nods as they passed. A few raised their glasses in quiet acknowledgement. Others simply watched with polite curiosity the way people do when they realize someone they underestimated carries a story larger than they assumed. I accepted it all the same way I had accepted the insult earlier. Calmly. Without performance. My father was still standing beside the wine table. He hadn't touched his drink again. For a long moment he stared at the floor, the lines on his face deeper than they had been an hour earlier. Age had always been visible in him, but tonight something else had surfaced, uncertainty. Finally he cleared his throat. "You're an admiral," he said quietly. "Yes." The words seemed to settle heavily in the space between us. He looked toward the stage where the bride had returned to her husband's side. The two of them were laughing with guests again, their hands intertwined, the kind of happiness that feels effortless when life has treated you kindly. Then he looked back at me. "You've done well," he said. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest he had ever come. I studied him for a moment before answering. "I've done the work I believed in." His mouth tightened slightly. "You could have told us. You could have asked." The same sentence as before. This time it landed differently. He exhaled slowly, rubbing one hand across the back of his neck, the way he used to when something unsettled him. "I didn't know where you were," he said. "You knew I joined the Navy." "That was 21 years ago." "Yes." He hesitated. "I assumed," he began, then stopped. "You assumed I failed." He didn't deny it. Silence settled again between us, but it wasn't the same silence as earlier. The tension had changed shape. The sharp edge of accusation had softened into something more complicated. Regret, perhaps? Across the ballroom, someone began laughing loudly at a joke. The sound floated toward us, warm and ordinary. Life continuing. "I read something about a haze in the news a few years back," my father said slowly. "Naval officer, command decision during a convoy operation." That was me. He nodded once, absorbing the information with visible effort. "You saved those ships?" "Yes." "And the crew?" "Yes." His eyes lingered on my face again, as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same person. The daughter he had pushed out of his house. And the woman standing calmly in front of him now. "I didn't know," he said again. The sentence sounded different this time. Less defensive. More honest. "I know," I replied. We stood there for a moment longer, two people connected by blood but separated by choices neither of us could undo. Then my father did something unexpected. He straightened slightly. Not the stiff posture of pride. Just the simple act of standing upright. "My daughter," he said quietly, almost to himself, "an admiral." He gave a small shake of his head, half disbelief and half something else. Life has a strange sense of humor. Sometimes I agreed. He looked at me one more time, then extended his hand. For a second, I simply stared at it. When I was 19, I had wanted an apology. A confession. Some kind of acknowledgement that throwing your child out of a house leaves a mark that doesn't fade easily. But 21 years changes what matters. You stop needing other people to rewrite the past. You learn to stand comfortably inside the life you built without them. So I took his hand. His grip was firm, though not as strong as I remembered. "I'm glad you came tonight," he said. "I came for Daniel." "I know." Another pause. Then he added quietly, "Still." Across the room, my nephew spotted us and raised his glass with a broad grin. His bride stood beside him, her expression warm and proud. "The future of the family." Uncomplicated. I returned the gesture with a small nod. "I should congratulate them before I leave," I said. "You're leaving already?" "Yes." My father seemed about to say something else, then stopped. Instead, he nodded. Well, it was good seeing you. You too. There were no dramatic reconciliations. No sudden tears. Some relationships aren't repaired in a single evening. But something important had happened tonight. The story he had carried for 21 years that I had run away and disappeared was gone. The truth had taken its place. And it hadn't required anger to make itself known. I walked across the ballroom floor toward my nephew and his new wife. They embraced me warmly, the kind of hug that comes easily when resentment hasn't had time to grow. Thank you for coming, Daniel said. I wouldn't have missed it. His wife smiled. My father always hoped he'd see you again, she said softly. I'm glad we met tonight. A few minutes later, I stepped outside. The evening air was cool, carrying the soft scent of spring flowers from the garden beyond the reception hall. Inside, music and laughter continued as the celebration moved forward. I stood there for a moment looking up at the quiet sky. 21 years earlier, I had walked away from my father's house with nothing but a duffel bag and a stubborn belief that dignity was worth protecting. Tonight I realized something simple. Dignity doesn't arrive when people finally approve of you. It arrives when you stop waiting for them to. If you've ever been told you didn't belong somewhere, if someone once tried to shrink your dreams because they were afraid of what your success might say about them, remember this. Your story doesn't end where someone else closes the door. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes decades. But truth has a way of walking back into the room exactly when it's needed. And when it does, it doesn't shout. It simply stands. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Leave a comment and share your thoughts below. Stories like this remind us that quiet strength matters more than loud victories. And if you enjoy these kinds of real-life inspired stories about dignity, family, and resilience, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. We have many more journeys to share. And I'm glad you walked through this one with me.